Hey, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome. I'm Safwan Masri, Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development, and I am excited to be with you for today's University Leadership Series, a programming series developed by the Global Centers to connect our international students dispersed around the world with the university, and as part of our broad mission to enhance Colombia's engagement with the world and and the exchange of global knowledge. Today's conversation promises to be a stimulating and wide-ranging discussion among colleagues in art, architecture, and neuroscience. But first, let me set the stage by offering a framing perspective for why these three disciplines have been brought together for us today. Evolutionary biologists once seemed to indicate that art and design were almost an appendage, unnecessary to human survival, and therefore the last field to arise after the brain developed language and reading and numeracy. More recent theories make the case that art and design are instinctive, a part of our brain from the very beginning. Indeed, the highest form of the brain's evolutionary development. Either way, artistic expression as humanity's crown achievement or the impulse to draw as universal, these theories reinforce the notion that everyone has the neurological capacity to think artistically. They also indicate the primacy of visual information to humanity. Art, design, and architecture express and allow us to share material truths that we have no other language for, that speak in form, color, volume, movement, arrangement, and as such elicit responses that are both conscious and unconscious, keeping us engaged with one another and with our collective identity. We are communicating in this manner all the time, in the fine arts, of course, but through design generally and in our buildings and lived environments. But how do we do so more deftly? No matter what our field of expertise, we benefit from understanding that the mind is always at work, processing what it sees and trying to convert that into a form that can be shared, even perhaps savored. One could go in myriad directions from here about the way we react to certain structures or landscapes. As we turn to my colleagues for discussion, I find myself thinking of Leonardo da Vinci and how he was able to visualize knowledge, both scientifically and artistically. His anatomical drawings of the brain, focusing on the connection between the eyes and the cranial nerves, show him mapping out how the brain functions and changes in response to the world around us. Ultimately, his anatomical observations allowed him to capture the precise movements involved in expressing emotion. And then, with color and form and a brush, he immortalized a smile. Enough said by me. Let me turn to the conversation at hand and introduce you to three extraordinary scholars and intellectuals, each powerhouses in their respective fields. Carol Becker is Professor of the Arts and Dean of Columbia University's School of the Arts. Carol is a member of the Global Agenda Council on the role of art in society for the World Economic Forum. She is the author of innumerable articles and several books, including The Subversive Imagination, Artists, Society, and Social Responsibility. Zones of Contention, Essays on Art, Institutions, Gender, and Anxiety. Surpassing the Spectacle, Global Transformations and the Changing Politics of Art. And her very personal long essay, Losing Helen. More than all of that, Carol is just the kind of person who ponders and understands humanity like no one else that I know. I am privileged to call her the dearest of friends. Amale Andraos is Dean of the Columbia University School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. Amale is co-founder with her husband Dan Wood of Work AC, a New York-based firm that was recently named the #1 design firm in the United States by Architect Magazine, and has also been recognized as the American Institute of Architects New York State Firm of the Year. Her recent publications include We'll Get There When We Cross That Bridge, Architecture and Representation, the Arab City, and Above the Pavement, the Farm. Amale is a special, rare individual whose lived experiences inform her nuanced, sensitive perspectives on humanity and our place in the world. I'm honored to also count Amale as a very dear friend. Now, Rui. Rui is Director and Chief Executive Officer of Columbia University's Mortimer B. Zuckerman Mind-Brain Behavior Institute. And he is a professor of neuroscience and neurology at Columbia's Vagelos College of Physicians and Surgeons. Rui has received numerous awards, including the 2017 Ariens Kappers Award by the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. And in 2019, he was elected to the National Academy of Medicine. Rui's scholarly publications are numerous, with titles that are both extraordinary and a bit intimidating. For instance, the endocannabinoid modulation of orbitostriatal circuits gates habit formation. Now, that is a mouthful. Rui, Carol, Amale, thank you so much for being here today. Let us start by exploring what drew you to your fields of inquiry. For the sake of full disclosure, my own education and training is in engineering. So neither the fields of art and design nor the kind of science we are talking about today factored into my own scholarly development, which raises the question, do artists and designers of form and space have different kinds of brains than, for example, accountants or engineers? Are creative types really a type, receiving and processing sensory information from the world around us in a manner that differs from the way others do? And if so, are they born that way? Or are their brains developing along with the discipline they study? So Carol, I'm going to turn to you in trying to address these questions. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about, were you born an artist? How much of what you are is nature versus nurture, do you think? Did your brain develop along with the discipline of literature, which is what you studied? How did you end up running 2 major art schools and writing about art?
I like this notion of the type, the creative type. Well, first of all, I'm a writer, as you so generously articulated. So I will try to do this as quickly as I can. I really was supposed to be a literary critic. That was my training, and it was the only aspiration I ever had in my life, was to study literature, which I did, and I got a PhD. But I finished all of that, English and American literature, and I was 25 years old. And I felt like I'd done it. Okay, now that was the life plan. Now it's over. I don't have another plan. But at that point, I went to become a journalist, and very quickly understood that although I really admire journalists and I love thinking like a journalist, I actually wasn't a great journalist. I could never do things fast enough. I could never do them short enough. I always wanted to read books and not magazines and newspapers. I just couldn't respond to the world that quickly. So I went back to teaching, but I was now in Chicago, having gone to Chicago. And to become a journalist, I started teaching at an art school, the Art Institute of Chicago, which has one of the great museums of the world, like the Met, and a school. So this is an amazing combination of production and also historicization of art, and also production of art. And I just fell in love with art school because I loved, and this relates to both Amale's world and Rui's world, I felt for the first time I was in a studio. I was in a lab. I was in some place that was an experimental institution completely devoted to process. And it was a bit wild and it was a bit wacky. And it wasn't the university. And I thought it was stupendous because you could keep reinventing yourself. That was the idea, that you could try anything. So instead of writing my first book, as I probably was supposed to do, about 19th century American literature, I wrote my first book on women and anxiety and change. And I realized that in that environment, you could become an expert in something that you knew nothing about. But I saw a social problem and I studied it for several years. And I decided I would write this book on anxiety, and then was all over talking about anxiety as if I were an expert. 5 years later, by the way, it took me 5 years to unlearn the academic writing style, so I could write this book. But there were several elements that will relate to our conversation. One is this notion of experimentation and the lab. The other is problem solving, that I was now in an environment where people posed a problem and then attempted to solve that problem, created the problem, and then tried to solve the problem. I was in a place of collaboration. I was in a place where people loved the physical world, materiality, the making of things. I was in a factory. as opposed to everybody writing books. So people were working in all these forms that I knew nothing about and had to learn about. And then I understood something really fundamental to art making and to art, which is that art is a manifestation of ideas in form. And it can manifest in multiple forms. Those ideas can take multiple forms, as opposed to just this one sort of academic way of writing or thinking. And I loved the new technologies that were embraced. In those days, they gave art schools computers because nobody was experimenting with them in the 80s. And all of a sudden, artists were just going nuts. Instead of Xeroxing parts of their body on Xerox, they actually had a computer. And I just loved all this evolution. And I think fundamentally, and after this, I'm gonna stop, I loved an environment which was risk-taking. And also, instead of thinking of myself now as someone who studied other people's books, I was now someone writing books. I was a writer. And that was a big shift from this notion of being an academic to being a writer and someone who actually created material other people would study and write about. So I'm gonna stop there, but all that permission came from being in an art school.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you. Fascinating. And some things I did not know about your having been destined to be an art critic, at least you thought. And
no, a literary critic, Safwan, a literary critic.
A literary critic, yeah, which is a form of art, right? I mean, and I think for our students, what's really, really important is to hear about renewal and evolution, right? Because, you know, at 20, you don't really know what you're going to be when you're 40 or what you're going to like when you're 50. So Rui, if I could ask you to interject, I mean, you look specifically at how the brain's mechanics influence our behavior, right? Innate and learned behavior. Why were you drawn to studying the brain, right? And this particular area of research?
So it's very interesting, as I hope you'll see today. So the brain makes us, in a sense, who we are as individuals. So what we love, what we hate, the way we think, subjective experience is only possible because we have brains. Our own ability to interact with the world is only possible because we have brains. And so I was fascinated. I mean, the ability to paint something, write something, to design a building, to create new things. These all just comes because we have brains. And I started interested very early. I grew up in a rural part of Portugal in what we call innate behaviors of other species, right? And I studied animals, but very quickly I learned a few things. One is that very few things were truly innate, right? I mean, of course, in us, breathing is pre-wired. We all breathe in the same way, or walking in generality. We walk in a similar way, but you could distinguish each of us by the way we walk. Even if you see me coming from afar, Safwan, you could say, oh, that's Rui, even before you see my face, just by the way I move. So we build a unique repertoire based on our brain's experience. And so if innate things are adapted for the species and they reflect our experience as a species, then the things each of us learns reflect our own experience. And I would say they're not two brains alike. And I think we're far from getting to the potential of these. And so then I started studying. I started by studying how we remembered episodes and facts. But very quickly, what drawn me is how we learn to act in the world, to be agents, to acquire new skills, this repertoire. You know, a bird can remember where they hid 2,000 seeds. I cannot remember where I park my car sometimes. However, this ability for us to create new things, to do new things. I mean, look at architecture, buildings. Is this the, no, and art, every generation learns the history of humanity in a way. I mean, the caricature in 25 years, that's cool. I mean, for the students here, we learn, and then we go on to do more at a pace that's amazing. So that's what fascinates me about studying the brain and being in this interdisciplinary environment. I mean, very close neighbors with Carol, and we hope with great interactions with the School of Architecture and Design.
I love that. And, for everybody who doesn't know this, you should know that it is by design of the university's leadership and Carol and Rui and other colleagues that the Zuckerman Institute for Mind Brain Behavior, which sits in the Science Center in the new campus in Manhattanville, sits right next to the Lenfest Center for the Arts. So maybe later on, we can talk about sort of that connection and why that was designed to be that way. But before we do that, Amal, over to you, and tell us your story. What drew you to architecture? Okay, and you've trained in this field. You're a practitioner. You're an academic. You're an academic administrator. How has all of this also affected your current environment and yourself within that environment? So, and your environment is quite global, right? And maybe you can touch on that.
Sure. Thank you, Safwan. I love the mist. I love what we said, that things are not innate, and what Carol said, the kind of accidents. And I know we're in this moment where students are thinking, they're committing their lives to something. So I spent 17 years swearing I would never become an architect because my father is a painter and an architect. And so I really did not want to become like him. But of course, I grew up, on construction sites in Saudi Arabia. He had a prefabricated housing company that he, created. And then we lived in Europe and Paris. We went to museums, constantly obsessed with art, with history, with culture. Then we moved to Montreal, and I was supposed to apply to school, and I would stay up all night flipping. I went to McGill, flipping the catalog. I was like, should I do law? Should I do, And I missed the application for the architecture school right as I decided that, okay, I give in, I give up. It's the only thing that I'm meant to do. So I ended up doing a year of economics and statistics, which, I had to do really well in because I had to get into architecture, but I hated it. I couldn't, it didn't. And a little bit like Carol, when I finally got into architecture school, it was like home. It was like a place where I could bring all these pieces and parts together. I was very interested in art, but I was also very interested actually in psychoanalysis and the kind of unconscious and the intuitive side and emotive side of knowledge. And I think having lived in so many places, and I just found that architecture could allow me to, be inside and outside at the same time, connect the mind and the body, move beyond my French Cartesian education. There was something about bringing things together, putting things back together in a life that had been quite fragmented. And this capacity that architecture and design can hold things together, even if they're not resolved, right? There are many fields where you have to come, it's either one or the other. But in architecture, it can be both. And multiple, and it was home. I could bring the personal and the global and the past and imagine the future. It's just a way to draw things together, and I think for me that's what's wonderful. And there's very few. I was thinking yesterday, because I always say that, and then I'm like, that's not true, but for architects, normally you get better as you get older. Like somehow your experience start to intersect with your intuition. I worked for Rem Koolhaas, a great architect. And I remember I was 20 something, very young when I started with him. And he walked into a room one day and there was a model of New York. We were working on a big competition, and we had done the model of the UN. Immediately he was like, that is not the UN. And I was like, wow, how can he tell? And the thing is, today I can. If I walk into a room and there's a model of the UN, it's not the right proportion and not the right scale, I can tell you. I know. It's like in my mind now, it's there. And so this sense of observation where things can move very fast without language just through perception, I just think it's amazing. And it just opens you up. And if you make space for that form of knowledge, I think it's just wonderful.
Oh, that's fascinating. That's fascinating, Amale. And I love the inside and outside, because you were born in Lebanon during the Civil War, right? You lived in Saudi Arabia in the sort of the Americana within Saudi Arabia, Aramco, and then you lived in Europe, in Paris, and then Montreal. So that's fascinating, sort of, how you captured that. So can we, and at some point, Carol, I'd love to hear from you about being married to an architect. Okay, so as an artist and being married to an architect. Well, maybe you unmuted, so go ahead.
But I wanted to say, before I say something about that, my architect husband was just right now measuring the floor. Well, I had to say, no, not now. Don't. I'm like, what are you doing? I'm in the webinar. But I want to say something to what Amale said, which was about getting better as you get older. And that's so interesting, because there's a kind of mix in all of our fields, because you can be young and have this unbelievable intuition, or you can pursue something that no one else has thought of simply because you don't have all of the weight of history on you yet. And yet there's an expertise that you get, first of all, you get wisdom, which is irreplaceable, but you also get experience. So you get better at the craft of something, but young people can just come in and do, and the art world is absolutely that. I mean, somebody can just do a painting that just blows everybody's mind, just breaks all the rules, and everybody goes, oh my God, where did that come from? And then, of course, can you sustain that for a lifetime? And just quickly about being married to an architect, which, by the way, I recommend, because for scientists or other architects or anybody who wants to work all the time, because architects work 24/7. And if you're someone who wants to work 24/7, the concept of weekend simply doesn't exist. So it's a good match if somebody wants to really work a lot. But I will say one thing about it that's fascinating and has been very useful to me. And I don't know if Amale will agree with this, because if you're building, there's usually a client, which means you have to adapt to someone else's desire. And even if you're like Rem, a Cool House, or you're a Renzo Piano, you have a client. I mean, when we were doing our building, Renzo wanted it to be a glass cube. And I said, well, Renzo, that's great, but what about the film program? And what about the theater program? And what about painters who don't want natural light? So he had to give up the glass cube, and then we negotiated what it would be. But architects have clients, and often artists don't. Like often artists, the client is yourself, or the writer, the client is yourself. And then you hope you pray that the world will embrace what you're doing, but it might not, which is why we hear so many stories of artists who don't get recognized in their lifetime. The world is simply not ready for what they're offering. Or the book that was rejected by 35 major publishers that then comes out 10 years later and is this big bestseller. So I watched the negotiation, the creative part of Jack, my husband, and the negotiation part that has to somehow negotiate, and also the physical materiality of the world. When you're writing, you can say anything. If you're painting, you can paint anything. But if you're actually building something, it has to stand out. There's going to be rain. There's going to be snow. It has to. And you were trained as an engineer, Safwan. You really know this, and you, of course, all know this. So I just throw that out. So it's interesting to watch the creative having to negotiate the physical so much for me. I'll stop.
So Rui, that's a great segue back to you. I mean, how does the brain negotiate the the artistic with the creative with the material, sort of the subjective with the objective, and how do we, by the way, I mean, let's bring the peculiar moment in history that we're living through now. And I want to pick up on something you said earlier, Rui, about sort of the innate behaviors like the walking, but then what you call the unique repertoire that we each develop. And how do you deal with that? How does the brain cope with repetitive motion, such as walking, right? But that gets disrupted because of something like the pandemic that we're living through.
so there are many, many interesting concepts in this discussion for that deal with the brain. So starting with your very direct question, my mentor, who was a immunologist, but she always said, as a scientist, you imagined it before you looked in the microscope. And you know, she taught me a lot. She would take us as students to the art museum in Porto and make us describe a painting, for example. And then, but like for 1 hour and say, I'm done. No, you haven't seen everything. Look again, look again, look again. She found what is now, you know, the immune systems that are in our gut and etc. by looking at training slides that have been seen by thousands of people. When she came in, they gave her to practice, and she saw all these things that no one saw just by looking again. So we have this idea that scientists, the physicality, the constraints is the world then may prove you wrong, right? You go and test, but you're not a tabula rasa going in, right? You have expectations, and you know, reality then violates or not those expectations. Even if you say, I don't have a hypothesis, right? Deep inside, if you are moved to that microscope, you want to see something. So you even think no one saw this. So it's imagined in your mind sometimes before it happens, but then you have to constrain it, and you have to adapt to the fact that the experiments are gonna tell you this, your imagination is wrong. And this is very hard because our brain builds our own reality, our own notion of self is built. I mean, when I walk into a building that Amale designed, I perceive something, which is not what you built. It's my building of what you built. Mm. So this then touches with, I think, what we discussed here with the building of routine. So learning in a way, right? It's people think learning is amazing, but you could also consider it is amazing, but it's the closing of doors. You become expert at some things, but some, you know, it's the taming of possibilities, right? Which is both happy and sad, right? And one can be creative instinctively, very, you know, a new mathematician, a chess player, a poet, right? Usually very disruptive early on. That's when you produce something that is completely novel, right? But then this idea of, in some aspects, and you know, I don't want to generalize because, as I said, each brain is a brain, but in general, for example, big prose instead of poetry, right, gets much better, you know, narrative with age. The same thing with these, you know, things that we're discussing with architecture and what Carol called wisdom, this type of memory, you know, semantic memories, actually gets better. So Daphne Shohami in our center, she tests and it gets better with age. The ability to extract principles, imagine from a movie, instead of describing every single scene, gets much better. And so actually with Linda Fried of the public health school at Columbia, we started thinking, are we not taking advantage of our older brains and what they are experts at doing? You know, we retire people when you can't type very fast or draw very fast, but it's that our skill. Our skill now is this composite. So the idea for very, very complex things, imagine you build a narrative and then on top of a narrative, it's like math on top of math on top of math. It's language on top of language on top of language. And so these takes a lifetime to build, this repertoire. And so that's why I think this other type of creation, which is more complex, gets better actually with age, and that's to me it's fascinating, the lifelong evolution of the brain and the abilities at different parts. You know, our ability to learn from experience is one thing, but things that are very, very complex and no one ever got there, you know, a type of narrative. Saramago, who's Portuguese, he really only started writing at 58, and he was at his best after the 70s, right? He was a journalist, and he said, I couldn't, it wasn't even in my mind, this type of structure of narrative. And so this is fascinating, and I think we don't explore enough the fact that as a species, we're still evolving. Our brains are not at the top of evolution. You know, I would love to see 1,000 years from now how humans are using their brains, and it may be much better. Anyway, I don't know if Amale wants to comment.
No, that's fascinating, Rui, and that at the individual micro level, it's both fascinating and also reassuring, right? In that, you know, you don't remember the movie, but your mind subconsciously can extract principles from that movie that you lived, that really helps sort of develop and evolve your thinking and how you approach things in life. Carol, you wanted to comment on that.
Oh God, I could comment for an hour about what you just said. It's so good. But just two things, I'll try to be brief. One is then, absolutely agree to what I mean, it's so interesting what you're saying and what one gains over time. What holds people back over time is maybe a psychological phenomenon then, which is a kind of inhibition and fear of risk taking. So it would seem that to build into any plan about how to age well would be some way that you are constantly, as Black Mountain College used to say, leap before you look, that you're learning how to leap before you look always, so that you don't stop doing that. And then I have another question for you, which Safwan, you're going to have to bring back later, maybe, because it might not fit with this. But what you said about evolution, can we willfully evolve as a species?
I certainly hope so, especially given the rude awakenings of the last year. But I maybe I comment after Amale comments as well, and then because there's something specific I wanted to say about the role of art and architecture in this process that you just mentioned, and why they're so necessary, needed in our life. And I bet you they are there since we are the species Homo sapiens. In very simple things, even how you build a stick or your house, or how you but anyway, I wanted to comment on that because I think you would bring it together. But first, Amale,
we'll come back to it. So Amale,
I love where this is going, because I think just in this notion of trying to keep things together, right? I think the thing to do is you want to almost preserve a sort of childlike naivete, right? Like as an architect, you have to, like, even with all the experience, the thing you don't want to do is to repeat, like you want to listen and observe as if for the first time, and then somehow at the same time bring all of the experience and knowledge that you've acquired to integrate, so that this negotiation, I think that you talked about, Carol, is life, right? I mean, we want something, we imagine something, we desire something, and then how do we get there? You're kind of designing these conflicts together, and you just learn also to be better at designing those conflicts or integrating them, so that what ends up happening is actually a third or fourth, something that you didn't actually imagine without those constraints. So it's actually even better, right? It's more than what you had initially in your mind, which I think is always that process. Is always so interesting. But I think the psychological dimension, which is also the brain, which is the fight, between the creative and everything else, that's where I think for me practice, you wake up, you go to work, like the white page for writers, or right, how do you build a process? I mean, artists, architects, etc., surround themselves with a daily practice, a process to almost bypass these psychological things, right? You turn something upside down, so I think we learn tricks to combat our own resistance, somehow. That's what I try to
adapt.
Yeah, and this brings us back then now, if you don't mind, Safwan, to your question about the routines and habits, which I study. So these are extremely useful because first, when we learn something, even, eating with a fork, we take 4 years, to really properly use a fork. It's a lot of cognitive ability. I have young kids, but then we routinize these things. So at one point, you don't want to focus on how your hand is drawing in the paper if you're an architect or an artist. You want to focus on content. This thing comes automatic. So routines are good. But then the routine is also a routine of thought. And there are many techniques to break these, right? I mean, that don't need pharmacs or other things. I mean, but the use of certain pharmacs or drugs, I mean, really is this. Some of us, even simple things like having coffee or alcohol, they go to our reward centers and they produce something different. But the environment and the ability to wake, these release from immediacy. So now we have our routines, right? And why do we, in a building for science, Safwan, why do we choose Renzo piano? People are like, you're crazy. Why would you spend money on a famous architect? Just build a box, scientists, who cares, right? And then close to and you focus, we have artists in residence and we're putting paintings and sculptures and we have writer in residence. Why?
And climbing walls.
For that, because when you enter a new space or you see a new painting, this is what, leads you to have the subjective experience. And if you're surprised, the artist produces something you don't expect, and you enter a space that causes you a different physicality. People go into our building all transparent. You see the scientists. There are colors. There are corners. You're in one seminar. You see the other seminar room, right? All transparent. And we wanted collaboration. So Renzo says, I'm going to give you collaboration, right? So this is critical. This is what Amale says. So we need these. Can you be very creative if you're in an empty room, in a cell for a long time? Maybe if you're extraordinary, but many of us need to break those routines. Now, there's a downside, which is, of course, I said there's tremendous advantage of having the routines and the habits. So when we break, there is anxiety, there's uncertainty, right? It's not comfortable, right? And so it can feel pleasurable for many of those that get addicted to it in a way, but it can feel very uncomfortable, this uncertainty for many people. So for example, the last year, where most of us break our routines, has led to a lot of people in the world questioning, what am I doing? Shifting homes. I mean, you see all these people, people are moving and they are doing other things. Why? There's this questioning, but also extreme anxiety, because you have to be comfortable with not knowing. And this is tough. Imagine for scientists, what you should expect is failure most of the time. You create a hypothesis in your head, and then you're going to go and see if the world works like that. Most likely not. But you have to persist and be an optimist. So humanity needs, our brains need, but not the brain, my brain, everyone's brains need these provocations, these violations of expectations, and architecture, the way you design a building, the way you design the subway, the way you design things can lead you, and art, I believe, to have the right behavior, the right policy, to adopt more walking, how are we, if we're aging and most of our society is going to be 50 plus, how should we design the world? And we're not thinking about this. We can. Anyway.
Yeah, no, really fascinating, really fascinating. And you mentioned Linda Fried and her work on aging, and you just mentioned sort of aging cities and urban settings and so on. So I'm going to turn to you, Amal, and talk about sort of the intersection amongst all of these things, right? I mean, you as an architect, as a dean of School of Architecture, you're talking with your colleagues across campus in ways that your predecessors never did or had to, right? I mean, you're in conversation with an artist, with a neuroscientist, and you talk with people in public health and in engineering, and all of this has become increasingly important. So talk to us a little bit. I know you've been thinking about the intersection amongst these fields, architecture and design, art, neuroscience in particular, how that shapes our consciousness. And then if you can take it even a step further for the benefit of our students who are not necessarily studying any of those fields, right? What does this mean to them?
Yeah, I think it goes back, I think that we're in a moment where there's a lot of habits that need to be broken, including disciplinary habits, right? The idea that, I mean, certainly in academia, right, it's all founded on disciplines and the individual demonstrating originality on their own. And, all these things are incredible and amazing, and there's so few spaces where one is able to do that. But if you overlap that with the urgencies today in the world, the complexities and the speed at which these issues are appearing, everything from the speed of change of climate change, and we have to think across so many different scales, right? Like climate change is across, centuries, millennia, and then it's 10 years. We have 10 years to act, right? So like how does a brain compute scale like that? How do you compute and create a relationship between, I'm going to use this material because it's sustainable, it has less embodied energy, and then large scale resilience plans for water. And so I think these two things. One is, I think, as architects and designers, and I think it's the same with scientists and Carol, the capacity to think across scales of time, right? We learn about history, but we also are constantly optimistically projecting in the future, imagining a future, etc. We're iterating scenarios. So to think across scale of time and also space, the kind of right here, right now, but also large scale issues, I think is crucial. And the second part is we can't do it alone. We never could do it alone. And now, more than ever, we need to collaborate. And, it's a cliche, but we have to find intersections, as we are doing now, in the way that our disciplines operate, in the way that we ask questions, we frame them. And because there's so many similarities, and then the differences are where we can, kind of really combine to look at a problem from so many different perspectives, right? In the end, that's also what it is. You have to be able to shift because of the uncertainty, right? How do you act at a time of uncertainty, not knowing and still yet implementing, imagining, iterating scenarios, visualizing, communicating, when you draw, when you make models, when you're already projecting in the future as if it existed, and that can be incredibly useful. You're integrating all these narratives together, all these perspectives, not just one. I think this capacity that we can integrate knowledge in so many different ways. So I think more than ever, we have to find faster, better intersections. They don't have to be complete. They don't have to be, but I think it's crucial if we're going to be able to adapt. We don't have much time.
Yep. So Carol, I'm going to turn to you before we open it up to, we have 3 students who want to ask questions on camera. Carol, go ahead.
Just quickly to pick up with what Amal just said, this issue of the problems of the world is very important because the scale of the problem are so big and so complex that there is no one discipline, as Amal says, there's no one discipline that can solve it. And that's creating this urgency to work together. I really do believe. And also to completely rethink the university, I would add to this, because we're still perpetuating this notion of disciplines. And it's taking all of us to cross over. It's a tremendous amount of effort it doesn't come organically to the structure of the institution that we would all be talking to each other. It's because we know of this urgency. And also, the last thing I will say about this, climate, which is the issue for so many young people. They understand that this home, this earth that we have, we could lose this. And this, to talk to Rui's point, is creating enormous anxiety. And the pandemic has just exacerbated that understanding that the world as we've known it can change so radically and be out of our control. So if we're not adaptable, and if we're not thinking in a really fluid way, there is no way to approach the world as we're looking at it now. It's changed in the last year. And one last thing, our relationship to other species has changed. I think people understand that we cannot live in this Anthropocene world, that we think that we are not related to all these other species, that everything we do is affecting everyone else. So that big idea and that big thinking is where we're all trying to get there in some way through our own disciplines. We're trying to get there.
I love that. I love that. And it's not only through our own disciplines, but to Amale's point, you can't do it alone, and no one discipline can do it alone. So integration, collaboration has never been as important. And to our students, I think one of the very important messages is it doesn't matter what it is that you're studying. You've got to know about other things, and you've got to reach out beyond your boundaries. To college students, I always say it doesn't matter what skills you acquire when you're in college. It's there to really help prepare you for life, because you don't know what life is going to bring and what kind of intersections you are going to have to build. So speaking of students, I'm going to turn first to Abhinav Gupta. Abhinav, if you can join us on camera. Abhinav is a student of yours, Amal. He's a student at the Graduate School of Architecture and Planning. Abhinav is in New York, and please go ahead, Abhinav, and ask your question.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for an engaging discussion. So I'm really fascinated as architecture sort of becomes more and more interdisciplinary. And as somebody that has been part of a lot of GSAP work on neuroscience and architecture, I'm really happy to see this discussion. So looking forward to more of these in the future. My question is on architectural technology and pedagogy in this sort of more interdisciplinary world. So many of us in architecture are moving into coding, not only visual scripting, but coding, and to be able to both measure spatial and nervous system outputs and use whatever is measured as an input to make responsive spaces. So for example, in some research in our program, we're working on rethinking grids so that they're more responsive to the distortions of perception. And some of our peers at other architecture programs are even using tools that allow people to draw specific plans with specific nervous systems system outputs, which is pretty amazing. And with that, I'm just really curious, Amal and fellow panelists, what do you think about how our pedagogy has to be modified so that we have not only a better capacity, but also, even more time to learn these tools, these tools that are traditionally part of other disciplines as a part of the kit of tools of architectural technology that we readily apply to not only what, but how we are designing. Thank you.
Thanks, Abhinav. And yeah, I know it's bubbling up at GSAP in really exciting ways. So I'm really glad to hear you're part of that. I completely agree about coding. And actually, we just this year started to insert some of it in the advanced representation course in the second semester and first year. But also, we just launched the Design Computational Practices program, which is going to bring all these things, new digital school tools and coding, and it kind of mix, kind of taking computer science, but also from a kind of architectural and design perspective with sort of critical input. And I'm very hopeful that that program will start to sort of feed into all of the other programs at the school as well. So, it's a language. We need to learn it. We need to own it. We need to be creative with it. My kids need to learn it. My daughter needs to learn it. So I think it's amazing, and we need to be to really become fluent and fluid in it, and also to be able to be. As an architect, we have to learn the tool and then be able to be critical and creative with it and undo it. Like I'm waiting for the undoing of the tool. And so it's, anyway, I think it's a great question, and I certainly want to support that, increasingly.
Thank you.
So, yeah, I just wanted to add to some of that Carol was mentioning, we want to create a new type of bilingual or trilingual kids. It's much easier to learn the languages at the same time than later on to have people that are already super specialized go and collaborate, like in our case. Myself, I did theater and played volleyball during college, and I'm a veterinarian, all because of pleasure, have nothing to do but influence what I do. So the first aspect is this aspect of formation. Is it better to go very quickly to be specialized, or is it okay for some aspects to delay that maturation in a way, to have as Safwan mentions, the real university experience, which should be universal, and then go down. The second aspect that I wanted to mention is what you mentioned about the interactions between architecture, and we could apply it for art, and the brain directly, or the nervous system. And so, together with climate change, brain health in general is the biggest public health issue that we have. 1 in every 4 or 5 of us is going to have a severe brain problem. And people always think, oh, so MBBI is the results of brain research are going to result in a pill, right? That's going to cure people. But the applications of knowledge about the brain are much wider. They are about education. They're about how we make decisions, how we make policy. And so this idea that instead of us thinking, oh, I have an intuition that if I design, stairs this way, the brain will perceive it in another way, and people will take the stairs instead of the elevator. Maybe we could measure, right? We can measure the impact of the building and even test things, right? And so this is a way in which the knowledge of the brain can impact real life behavior and how we live as a society, can have an application that is not a pill. So our research in brain and mind, I think, goes beyond trying to get pills. We believe that understanding how the brain works can lead us to better lives because we'll utilize our brain better.
That's great. Thank you, Rui. Thank you, Amal. The next question, Carol, is from a student at the School of the Arts, Angeline Joel Diambro, sorry. Angeline, please go ahead with your question.
Well, thank you all so much for such a wonderful conversation today. I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit more about imagining the future and like shaping the society we all want to be part of. How can that actually become an act of collaboration that we undertake in our everyday lives? And also, what does that look like for each of you in your own fields and disciplines?
Well, maybe I'll jump in.
Please.
So two things. I think, as architects, we always are projecting in the future. Actually, my practice, we did a research called 49 Cities, where we redrew and reanalyzed 49 visionary cities, but from an ecological lens, with the idea that if you just looked at the environmental conditions of the Roman city, what could we learn from it? So it's a kind of constant movement from past to future. And in that movement, there is also learning from past failures and, the excesses of believing technology will solve everything, or the excesses, right? We have to talk about issues of equity. We have to talk about, which we've seen, so exacerbated under COVID, where COVID, its impact was the greatest in the neighborhoods of people of color, Black people in the US, and it's just that overlay of the built environment and social injustice and inequity is really crucial. So I'm saying that because the collective and part of your question is crucial. Who is imagining the future of cities? Who's around the table, and maximizing those voices across disciplines, across different perspectives, across, that's crucial. And then bringing all those voices together to iterate and develop scenarios. As architects, we can with artists, with others, we can do that. And then, I can imagine, when you build a model, a physical model, even, it's so amazing because you can project yourself right there. You can like from your body to the scale of a figurine in a space, you can project yourself, and you can imagine what would it feel like if I was in a space where, I don't know, we were recycling everything, or we were producing methane and, to swim in beautiful pools. So it is a moment where we have to trigger the imagination to allow us to imagine a different way of living on the planet, but we have to do it, make sure to do it in an inclusive way in terms of who's around the table imagining. And I think this is the biggest challenge right now, is how do we make sure there is representation of underrepresented voices as we imagine the future on the planet.
Thank you. Carol?
Such a great question. One of the things I always try to talk about when I talk about an art school is the value that the society does not place on the role of the imagination in the evolution of consciousness and in the evolution of human development. That we don't cultivate imagination. And yet, if we didn't have imagination, nothing could evolve, because we would never be able to imagine things that don't yet exist. So why we devalue that in the society is so fascinating to me. Like, why don't we believe and cultivate and support all the acts of imagining that lead to the future? And so I just put that out because so much of the work that you're all doing in film is you're telling the stories to touch people's imagination and to touch their hearts. Because without touching people's hearts, there really isn't any change. People have to really understand the consequence of the directions we're going in, as Mal's talking about, or Rui, where are we going? And where do we want to go? That those conversations, you can't just have them with your mind. No offense, Rui. I know that the mind and the heart are connected, but you have to have it also with your heart. And that's where art and the imagination come in.
Thank you. Thank you, Carol.
Do you mind if I follow just 1 minute on this? So the subheading of the Zuckerman Mind, Brain, and Behavior is going to be, it's still releasing, the future in mind, exactly because of this. And so this that was just said here is very important. I study this even in my own lab. We learn from consequence, but there's a time window for which we learn very well. And then as things dissipate in time, we don't. So for example, we learn very quickly to be afraid of a bear that could attack us, but we're less afraid of mosquitoes. We get a bite, we may get malaria 2 days later, or even COVID. The temporal window is very long. We cannot see the consequence. So let's take the example of climate change, racial injustice. We cannot see the consequence. So art and architecture, they can bring it to the immediacy. They can bring you a representation of that consequence. Here's how it's going to look like, imagine in a film. And then all of a sudden, it can make you learn now based on the imagined future. So this is with the brain alone. By consequence, we need to wait 50 years to say, and it's like, whoa, what a bad thing I did. When you learn to play tennis, you see the ball landing on the other side, and either you did it correctly or not. Imagine the ball lands 50 years later. How are you going to learn? If someone says, I'm going to bring you that ball from the future and show it right now in your building, in this painting, in this book, in this movie, that's why it's so important and so inspiring.
Wow. Thank you, Rui. So we're running out of time, but we have a question from a college student, and then we have questions from the audience, which I have a way of dealing with because so many really great questions. But let's turn to Sean Lee, who is a college student currently in Hong Kong. Sean, over to you.
Thank you. Actually, in the past 20 minutes, President Bollinger sent an email on Colombia's 10-year plan on sustainability. And my question was going to be, what is the role of the artist and architect in society? And to what extent does the way our brain works inform or possibly limit such activity? And maybe this whole thing with sustainability might have a, I mean, I think architects, there is such a great role for architects with sustainability, and artists and psychologists as well. So
thank you, Sean. And maybe in addressing Sean's question, we can also, I mean, for those of us who are not artists or architects, how do we think like artists and architects in a way that contributes to society and to our own individual and collective evolution? Who'd like to take the question about sustainability first? Sean, you think that's a tough question?
No, I mean, sustainability is everything, right? I mean, it's I think that the complexity now is to not think anything in isolation, right? Like nothing is isolated, everything is connected. I always we did a project on food and cities when I first started my practice, and became very good friends with scientists and farmers and chefs, and had amazing conversations. And I always loved the fact that when a chef designs a plate, all right, there's a sense of color, texture, food, but there's also taste, but there's also a sense of who prepared the plate, and what is that experience, and where does the food come from, and how much energy does it take to bring the food to that plate. And so it's like you from just that frame of your plate, you can make connections to so many different parts of the planet, parts of and so I'm just saying, in everyone's practice, to think what you're doing is connected to so many other pieces, and how do you impact those pieces through what you're doing? I think that's the thinking that we need, right? That we're not just living and flushing turning on the faucet. And I mean, I think in the 60s, it's like people popped pills and it was so cool. And it was like, I don't need, where did the pill come from? Where did my plastic meal come from? And so everything comes from somewhere and everything goes somewhere, and that we're part of this cycle. And so I think for the brain it's a lot to take on, and to kind of rewire this notion of being connected to each other, even across you and me, like so many miles between us, and yet we're here, and what happens here impacts you, and vice versa. I think that sense is almost, you cannot think of it through reason. You have to form knowledge through other means. And I think what Rui is saying, and what Carol is saying about the arts, like we need to access these other forms of knowing, because we cannot compute this rationally, linearly anymore. It is too big. And it was always too big. We just thought we could control it. So
that's great. Carol, and maybe, if it's not too much, maybe, one of the questions here from the audience is about the issue of climate and sustainability and so on, and racial injustice and how that is impacted by it.
It's interesting, your question, Safwan, and Sean's question about the role of the artist, and your question about what can other people who aren't artists or architects or neuroscientists be thinking about. And I was going to go to this whole other thing, which had to do with exactly racial injustice. And the other day in the New York Times, there was an entire page of all these artists who've come together around anti-Asian racism that we've been seeing a lot in the US, and the way that they are responding by making visible the issue, and through visual imagery, visual imagery of language. Even artists who traditionally have not been political artists have jumped in to use their skill base to say, we're not going to hide this issue. We're going to make this issue visible. And I think that we just saw with Black Lives Matter. I mean, the consequence of the visibility of that youth movement, mostly youth movement of BIPOC, but I'm white and young and old, everybody coming together, was such a powerful force that the trial verdict the other day is just a direct result of making visible what otherwise has been invisible. And I think that is something that every discipline can work to do by crossing over and working with everyone else. And I think that the role of the imagination in every field is essential. There's not one thing I can think of where the ability to stay in that state of mind we were talking about, this, state of imagining and valuing it and supporting it. It's important in every discipline that exists. And to Amale's point and to Rui's point, how do you keep that alive in yourself? Because if you can't keep it alive in yourself, you can't transmit it to other people. You have to be able to transmit that enthusiasm for the imagining of another future. And I think that's where no discipline's going to do this alone. No group of people are going to do it alone. We have enormous physical, psychological challenges as a species, just enormous. That's why I asked Rui, can we decide to consciously evolve, or do we just have to evolve because we just do, like we don't think through our own evolution? But can we now start thinking, how do we want to evolve as a species? To answer that, we need every discipline.
Yeah, so this is the exact question. That's where I was going to take, Carol. It's like we may be in a unique position, at least on Earth, of being a species that's at the risk of extinction, partly because of their own behavior, and has a notion of this. So it's like having the notion of death, right? It's very fatalistic. It gives us a sense of urgency. It gives meaning to life. So at the moment, as a species, we still don't have that conscious, and maybe it's starting. So, to Sean's point, at the moment, as scientists, we can understand quite well the consequences of some of our behaviors. And so to what Amale says, the reason, if you ask me. But even I, that read those reports and know every detail and talk with Alex, have difficulty changing my everyday decision-making or behavior. And so a lot of the effort we're trying to do with data science and climate change is how can what we know about decision making and how to develop these routines help us actually have behaviors that make us sustainable, right? And so evolution happens with or without us, like Carol, as Carol mentions. I'm a post-humanist optimist in a way, right? Like if we don't change, some other species will, or maybe 90% of us won't. But we are in this unique position. I mean, I'm going to use a stupid analogy, but maybe it causes some guttural feeling in people. Imagine the dinosaurs had a notion that they were going to be extinct, and that a great part of that, of what happened on Earth, they had a notion they caused it. Would have. This is us right now. I mean, part of these maybe natural evolution of Earth, a great part, we cause it. And the denial of that agency is the agency as a species. We're built to have agency as individuals, but as a species. And it comes to the collaborative work. No building is built by one architect. Yeah. But in science, you say, oh, that genius, I have a huge team of much more talented people than me. They do the work. And even the credit assignment is wrong. And this goes to justice, right? We couldn't, without diversity, we're useless, I would say, from an evolutionary standpoint, because we don't know the future. We don't know what type of thought is going to make us more adaptable in 50 years. That's why we need to keep all these prickling.
Yeah. Thank you, Sean. So it's amazing that our audience has stayed with us. We've only lost a few, even though we are 10 minutes over time. So I'm going to impose upon you and say, let's stay on for another 5 minutes. And I'm going to try to take some questions. There's so many great questions that have been posed, and some of them have been addressed, in various things that you've said. But I'm going to turn to each of you with a question and give you a chance to make your closing remarks. So, Rui, I'm going to start with you because we have a question from a Columbia neuroscience student who's doing exactly what all of us want that person to do, and that is take classes outside of neuroscience, right? To see how issues and problems are being looked at and tackled from different disciplines. And this student says that a sociology major, a graduate student, asked the student, what could neuroscience teach you about empathy and human thought? Which is, I hope that this whole session and webinar has really sort of given the student a lot of ammunition that they can use. But the question is, how do you address that? What do you tell somebody who asks a question like this?
So this is fascinating. I talked about the knowledge of neuroscience for us as a society, how it impacts us, but it impacts us as individuals. I'm going to give you an example. I thought, or I have a notion of myself, that I have a really good memory and photographic memory. From the moment I had scientific evidence that we fabricate our memories, that we build them in a way, and we can build false memories, this changed my perspective with the others. And from the moment I could do, even in animals, that I could not determine the reason why they were performing a certain movement, just based on observation. I had to ask scientific questions, probe a lot. This led me to believe, first, just by observing, I cannot infer intention. Scientifically, I cannot. I would have to ask questions. So if someone is doing A or B. Second, I may see things different than the other. This helps with empathy. So if we all were trained, imagine in schools, that these as a fact, curricular fact, like math, you build your own, he or she builds their own memory. All of us have our own individual memories, and it made about the same fact, and the perceptions and constructions are different. And then this idea that the other feels, and their feelings are so vivid as our feelings, like this theory of mind. So if we would get the notion of that, I think it helps a lot. It has helped me. I used to have endless arguments. No, it wasn't exactly like that happened. And it helped me to realize I'm arguing about the movie I had in my head, and they are arguing based on the movie they had in their head. So I think there's a lot of knowledge we can have as a species by understanding how we actually form beliefs about our own life. So this is what I would say. We understand biases better nowadays. We had a wonderful event with President Bollinger last week in which we discussed this, and how the understanding of bias, which can be good in some situations, can help us actually fight bias exactly in the situations of racism and others.
Fascinating. Amal, I'm going to turn to you and sort of combine two themes in it. So we have a question from India about the sense of place and sense of space, right? And how do you combine the two, or how do architects, what's the difference between the neuroscientist's view of this and an architect's view of this? And I'm going to append also another question that comes from another student, and that is, what do you see as the long-term impacts in the area of urban design and architecture of the moment that we are in today? And with remote work, for example, and the way that we are just dealing with our environments and so on. So your closing words.
Sure. I would offer that space is an abstraction and place is grounded in kind of cultural reality, let's say. And I think that, as architects, we often are invited to everywhere, actually. I was, really interested in Rui's, as architects, you have to shift perspective. Carol was saying you're designing for a client. You're arriving in a community that you may think right? But actually you don't know, and you got to ask the questions. And we're learning to ask better questions, I have to say. So it's this kind of dialogue that then ends up, hopefully at best, producing something that starts with one's own process, but then integrates other perspectives as well. And I think certainly for me in my practice, working in different places around the world, trying to, one way to do this is to immediately collaborate with someone who's there, or, and like almost like a, so that it anchors it through the perspective and the experience of that person, right? That just to kind of undo the, we just arrived here. And then there is your own experience and, the difference and the sameness. And so all of this gets, it's a conversation. And even, I work with a partner and I work with a team, and my partner, Dan Wood, and I have very different experiences. And so we work in a kind of dialogue and disagreement. And we actually have this thing where we have long ago agreed never to disagree, i.e. unless we get to a third, fourth, fifth place, it's not good enough. So it's an evolution. I think right now, the moment we're in, I see two tensions. On the one hand, technology is going to speed up in terms of solutions, and we're talking about data science and artificial intelligence and measuring, and smart cities, and there's a great urgency developing, different kinds of, replacing concrete with new materials. We need the technological advances, but we also have to think about equity and representation, and making sure that these cities are for across different, really echo this movement of really very strong movement for social justice and racial equity. And I think there's this, these two tensions, because yes, we can design, there are amazing cities being designed in other places of the world that are net zero, and but unless they are going hand in hand with a commitment for social and racial equity, I think we're going to have, it will be a disaster, and that's not what we should be designing and working towards. Because if you care for the most vulnerable, ideally you lift everyone up, right? I mean, that is the, so it's, I think the kind of acceleration of technology is going to have to be in great tension, and always has, with issues of equity and representation. So that's the tension that I see, and the opportunity of bringing those two things to serve one another.
And the necessity of it all. Very, very, very apt. Thank you, Amale. Thank you for those words. Carol, you're going to have the last word, and I just want to tell everybody, this was your idea, Carol. It was great, and I want to thank you for it. Carol was like, why don't we have this, and bring in architecture and art and Rui, and the neuroscience and how we think about all of those things. And like all of your ideas, it was a great idea. And want you to say whatever you want to say. There are a couple of questions that are very brief. Feel free to answer them or not. But one student asked, should I be analyzing or using my intuition more? And then another one asked, how do you define the quality? How do you define quality aesthetically? How do you define the quality of an aesthetic thing? Anyway, so take those or not, take it anyway and anywhere you want to take it.
Those, we don't have another hour, so we'll have to do this briefly. It was your idea that we should be Amale and me, and my idea to throw Rui in the mix had a lot to do with who, not just the disciplines, but how people think and their ability to do what we're talking about, which is think across disciplines and to bring it all together and think about the world. So it wasn't so difficult to think of which colleagues should, be together. Yeah. So I tell me that first question again. I got stuck on the aesthetic question. Oh, intuition versus
Analysis versus intuition, exactly.
You know, I think all these polarizations should go away and not worry about them. I think that to survive in the world and to do work well in the world, you need all of that. You need to keep your mind and those analytic skills, you need to keep developing them and figure out how to do it. And then you need to keep this creative, intuitive part growing and developing and deepening and widening as you grow and mature, so that you have this balance. I think we polarized everything in this world, and we need to stop doing that fundamentally. So I think the desire to even cultivate both those things is exactly the right desire. So it's a great question. And I think we should end with that these contradictions, these polarizations, we're in a new moment now. We have to think dialectically, and we have to bring things together, and even in our own being, we have to bring them together. And the more that we're able to do that, the more our work will do that, the more our relations will do that, the more society will come together, and we will actually operate as a collective consciousness for the good, which is, I think, what we all want.
Thank you.
Thank you, Safwan, for bringing us together.
Brilliant. This was brilliant. Yeah, no, thank you. This was, could go on for hours, and I feel privileged because I know that this will continue amongst us for a very long time. So thank you so much, really.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Thank you. So much fun.
Bye.